The small cabin stood alone near the bend in the river, smoke curling from its chimney against the morning sky. Inside, 12-year-old Annie stirred a pot of porridge hanging over the fire, her movements practiced and efficient. She'd been doing this alone since winter took her ma and pa 6 months ago. The fever had come quick and stayed just long, enough to leave her with nothing but their little homestead and the skills they'd taught her. Annie brushed her light brown hair from her eyes and glanced around the one-room cabin that now felt too big and too quiet. The chair where Pa used to whittle sat empty in the corner. Ma's sewing basket remained untouched beside it. Sometimes Annie talked out loud just to break the silence, pretending they could still hear her. The townsfolk from the settlement had tried to take her in. Mrs. Thompson from the general store had offered her a place, and so had the blacksmith and his wife. But Annie couldn't bear to leave the only home she'd known. "I can manage," she told them, chin lifted high despite her trembling lip. "Pa taught me everything I need to know." Reluctantly, they'd agreed to let her stay, though someone rode out every few days with supplies and to check that she was still all right. Annie was grateful but always sent them away quickly. Their pitying looks made her feel small, and she'd rather be alone than be somebody's burden. After breakfast, Annie grabbed her basket and headed out to gather kindling. The autumn air held a chill that whispered of the coming winter. She'd need to stockpile as much wood as possible before the first snow. Pa had always said, "Prepare in plenty so you don't suffer in scarcity." Those words echoed in her mind as she walked along the riverbank, picking up fallen branches and breaking them to size. A heavy fog hung over the water, turning the far shore into nothing but shadows and shapes. Annie hummed softly to herself, a lullaby her ma used to sing, the familiar tune keeping her company as she worked. She was reaching for a thick branch when a movement across the river caught her eye. Annie froze, her hand suspended in midair. Through the swirling mist, she could make out a figure on the opposite bank. Not a deer or a fox, but a person, a girl who looked to be about her own age. The girl wore a fringed deerskin dress with colorful beadwork across the chest and moccasins on her feet. Her long black hair was braided with small feathers woven in. Annie recognized the clothing from the times she'd glimpsed members of the Shawnee tribe at a distance when traveling to town with her pa. The native girl was trying to cross at the shallowest part of the river, where stones broke the surface of the water. But something was wrong. The girl kept putting weight on her right foot and then jerking back in pain. She'd take a step into the water and then retreat to the bank, her face contorted with frustration. Annie hesitated. Pa had always told her to be careful around the native people. Not because they were bad, he'd been firm about that, but because misunderstandings happened easy when folks couldn't speak each other's language. Some of the settlers told scary stories about the Shawnee, but Pa had traded with them fairly and said they'd always been honest in return. "Folk are just folk," he'd told her once. "Don't matter what they look like or how they talk. Judge them by how they treat others, not by what others say about them." The native girl attempted to cross again, stepping carefully from stone to stone. When she put weight on her injured foot, she slipped, nearly falling into the cold water. She caught herself on a boulder, her face tight with pain. Annie didn't think twice after that. She dropped her basket of kindling and waded into the river. The water was icy around her ankles, then her calves as she moved deeper. Her woolen dress grew heavy as the hem soaked up water, but she kept her eyes on the struggling girl. The native girl spotted Annie approaching and went still as a deer catching a human scent. Her dark eyes widened with alarm, and she glanced back toward the forest as if considering retreat. But her injured foot seemed to keep her rooted in place. Annie raised her empty hands to show she meant no harm. She pointed to the girl's foot and then to herself, trying to signal that she wanted to help. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the narrowing gap of rushing water. Two girls from different worlds brought together by chance. The native girl's expression shifted from fear to wariness, to a cautious sort of curiosity. She didn't smile, but some of the tension left her shoulders. Annie reached the midpoint of the river where the current pushed hardest against her legs. The round stones beneath her feet were slick with moss, and she had to move carefully to keep her balance. She understood now why the injured girl was having such trouble. "It's all right," Annie called, though she knew the girl wouldn't understand her words. She hoped her tone would carry her meaning. "I'm coming to help you." The native girl watched Annie's slow approach, her hand tight around a small leather pouch hanging from her neck. When Annie was just a few feet away, the girl spoke words in a language Annie had never heard before. Though she couldn't understand them, the question in them was clear. Annie pointed again to the girl's foot, then to the shore near her cabin, and mimicked walking with support. The native girl studied Annie's face for a long moment, looking for something. Truth, perhaps, or kindness. Whatever she sought, she seemed to find it, because she gave a small nod. Moving the final distance between them, Annie reached out slowly and offered her arm for support. The native girl hesitated, then gripped Annie's forearm with surprising strength. Up close, Annie could see that her ankle was swollen and starting to bruise. Together, they began the careful journey across the river. Each step was a challenge. The native girl was light on her feet despite her injury, but she couldn't put full weight on her bad ankle. Annie had to brace herself against the current while also supporting the girl's weight. Twice they nearly fell when Annie's foot slipped on a submerged stone, but each time they steadied each other. Halfway across, the native girl looked at Annie's face and said something that sounded like a name. She tapped her chest and repeated it. Nakoma. Annie smiled, understanding dawning. Nakoma, she repeated, the unfamiliar name feeling strange on her tongue. Then she tapped her own chest. Annie. Ani, Nakoma echoed, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. By the time they reached the shore near Annie's cabin, both girls were breathing hard from the effort. Annie helped Nakoma to sit on a fallen log, then pointed toward the cabin and mimicked that she would return. Nakoma nodded, though her eyes followed Annie with lingering caution. Annie hurried to the cabin and returned with a cloth. A small jar of the healing salve Ma had taught her to make from herbs and a water skin. She knelt by Nakoma's injured foot and looked up, seeking permission. After a moment's consideration, Nakoma extended her foot. Gently, Annie removed the moccasin and winced at the swelling. She soaked the cloth in cool water and wrapped it around the ankle. Nakoma drew in a sharp breath but didn't pull away. As the morning fog began to lift, revealing the brilliant autumn colors of the forest, the two girls from different worlds sat together by the river. Neither understood the other's words, but in the simple act of helping a stranger in need, a connection had formed that transcended language. Annie didn't know it yet, but that connection would soon lead 30 warriors to stand at her walkway at dawn. The cool cloth seemed to bring Nakoma some relief. She watched with curious eyes as Annie gently applied the healing salve to her swollen ankle. The sharp smell of herbs filled the air between them, and Nakoma leaned forward to sniff it with interest. She pointed to the jar and made a questioning sound. Annie smiled and tried to explain. My ma taught me to make it, for hurts and swellings. She mimicked grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, then pointed to various plants around them. Though her words meant nothing to Nakoma, the girl nodded as if understanding the general idea. Nakoma reached for the small medicine pouch she wore and opened it, showing Annie the contents: dried leaves, small roots, and what looked like crushed berries. She pointed to Annie's salve, then to her own medicine, and smiled. Despite their different worlds, they shared this knowledge. You're a healer too? Annie asked, fascinated by this unexpected connection. Nakoma couldn't understand the question, but she pulled out a particular leaf from her pouch and mimicked brewing tea, then pretended to drink it, and made a face like someone with a cough feeling better. Annie nodded eagerly, recognizing the plant as one her ma had used for winter coughs. The sun climbed higher as they sat together by the riverbank. Annie's chores were forgotten as she and Nakoma found ways to communicate beyond words. With sticks, they drew pictures in the soft earth. Nakoma drew her village, simple shapes for the rounded lodges where her people lived. She pointed to one and tapped her chest, then drew 3 figures beside it. Your family? Annie asked, understanding dawning. She drew 3 stick figures, then crossed out 2 of them and pointed to the cabin, her face growing sad despite her efforts to hide it. Nakoma's eyes softened with understanding. She reached out hesitantly, her hand hovering in the air between them before gently touching Annie's arm in a gesture of comfort that needed no translation. A bird called from the trees across the river, and Nakoma's head snapped up. She looked at the position of the sun and made an anxious sound. Annie understood immediately. Time had gotten away from them and Nakoma needed to return to her people. They'll be worried about you, Annie said, rising to her feet. She helped Nakoma stand, supporting her weight as the girl tested her injured ankle. The swelling had gone down a bit, but it clearly still hurt to walk on it. Annie pointed to the river and made a questioning gesture. Nakoma nodded, but her eyes showed apprehension about crossing the slippery stones again. Annie didn't hesitate. She positioned herself at Nakoma's side, offering her shoulder for support. Together they waded back into the cold water. The crossing was easier this time. They had learned each other's movements and found a rhythm that worked. When Nakoma stumbled on a mossy stone, Annie caught her before she could fall. When the current pushed hard against them at the deepest part, they leaned into each other, finding strength in their combined balance. They reached the far shore, both breathing hard from the effort. Annie made to turn back, but Nakoma caught her hand. From a small pouch at her waist, she pulled out 2 perfect blackberries, late in the season and all the more precious for it. She pressed them into Annie's palm and folded her fingers closed around them, the gesture saying more than words could. Annie smiled and nodded her thanks. As she turned to go, Nakoma called out something in her language. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable, a promise to return. Back at her cabin, Annie found herself humming as she went about her chores. The day that had started like any other now felt special, marked by the strange new friendship. As she collected the kindlings she'd abandoned earlier, she wondered if she would ever see Nakoma again, or if their meeting had been just a passing moment, never to be repeated. That evening, as darkness fell, Annie sat by her fire and ate her simple supper. The cabin still felt empty without her parents, but somehow less lonely than before. She found herself glancing toward the door, half expecting a knock, though she knew it was foolish. The Shawnee wouldn't come to a settler's cabin, especially after dark. Just as she was preparing for bed, a soft sound came from outside, not at the door, but at the window. Annie froze, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. Pa had taught her to be cautious of nighttime visitors. She picked up his old hunting knife from the shelf and approached the window slowly. Peering through the glass, she gasped. Nakoma stood outside, her face half hidden in shadow. She wasn't alone. A taller figure stood beside her, a woman with gray streaks in her long dark hair and the same proud bearing as Nakoma. Annie set down the knife and opened the door. Nakoma smiled when she saw her, relief clear on her face. She spoke rapidly to the older woman, who studied Annie with keen eyes that missed nothing. The woman stepped forward, her movements graceful despite her age. She wore more elaborate clothing than Nakoma, with intricate beadwork and several necklaces of carved bone and stone. From the way Nakoma deferred to her, Annie guessed she must be someone important in their tribe. Nakoma made gestures between them, clearly trying to explain who Annie was and what had happened. The older woman listened, then approached Annie slowly. She reached out and took Annie's hands in her own, turning them palm up. Annie stood perfectly still, unsure what was happening but trusting Nakoma's reassuring presence. The woman examined Annie's palms, the calluses from chopping wood and tending the garden, the small burn mark from cooking. Then she looked into Annie's eyes for a long moment before nodding, as if confirming something to herself. From a pouch at her waist, she withdrew a small object wrapped in a soft piece of deerskin. She placed it in Annie's hands and folded her fingers around it, just as Nakoma had done with the berries. When Annie unwrapped it, she found a bracelet of woven fibers with small shells and colored stones worked into the pattern. "For me?" she asked, looking between them in surprise. The woman spoke in a low, musical voice. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, the meaning seemed clear. A gift of thanks for helping Nakoma. Annie slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, where it fit perfectly. "Thank you," she said, touching her heart. "Would you like to come inside? I have tea." She mimicked drinking, and after a moment's hesitation, the woman nodded. Inside the cabin, both visitors looked around with undisguised curiosity. Nakoma pointed to Annie's few books with wonder, never having seen such objects before. The woman examined the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, nodding with approval at Annie's stores. As Annie prepared the tea, she noticed Nakoma limping to the table. Her ankle looked better, but still tender. The older woman said something to Nakoma, who sat obediently while the woman unwrapped Annie's cloth and examined the ankle. She produced her own medicine pouch, larger and more elaborate than Nakoma's, and mixed some herbs with water to make a paste. She gestured for Annie to watch as she applied it to Nakoma's ankle, clearly teaching her. Annie paid close attention to the mixture and the way the woman's fingers moved in a gentle circular pattern. When she finished, the woman pointed to Annie's salve jar on the shelf and made a questioning gesture. Annie brought it to her, and the woman smelled it, nodded approvingly, then added a pinch of something from her own pouch to strengthen it. She demonstrated how to mix it better, showing Annie a different technique. As they drank the tea, the three of them found ways to communicate despite the language barrier. With gestures and drawings in the ash by the hearth, Annie learned that the woman was Nakoma's grandmother and the tribe's healer. Nakoma had been collecting special plants for medicine when she fell and hurt her ankle. When it was time for them to leave, the grandmother took Annie's face between her hands and spoke words that sounded like a blessing. Nakoma hugged her, a quick, shy embrace that Annie returned, surprised but pleased. From the doorway, Annie watched them disappear into the night, two shadows melting into the darkness. The bracelet around her wrist caught the firelight, the small shells gleaming. For the first time since her parents died, Annie fell asleep with a smile on her face, wondering what tomorrow might bring. 3 days passed without any sign of Nakoma. Annie found herself pausing in her chores to glance toward the river more often than she'd care to admit. Each time she did, the water flowed empty and undisturbed between its banks. The bracelet around her wrist caught the sunlight as she worked, a constant reminder that she hadn't dreamed the whole thing. The weather had turned colder. With morning frost silvering the grass around her cabin, Annie had spent the days preparing for winter, chopping extra wood, smoking the last of the summer's meat, and sealing the cracks in her cabin walls with mud and straw the way Pa had taught her. Hard work kept her hands busy, but her mind often wandered to Nakoma and her grandmother. On the fourth morning, Annie woke before dawn. Something had disturbed her sleep. A sound, perhaps, or just that sense people sometimes get when they're being watched. She lay still in her bed, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the soft popping of the banked fire. Then came a light tap at the window. Annie slipped from beneath her quilt and padded across the cold floor. Drawing back the curtain, she peered into the gray pre-dawn light. Nakoma stood outside, her breath making small clouds in the chilly air. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a boy who looked a year or two older, with the same proud bearing and watchful eyes. Annie opened the door, shivering as cold air rushed in. "Nakoma?" she said. Happiness clear in her voice despite the early hour. She gestured them inside, but both hesitated on the threshold. Nakoma pointed urgently across the river, then to the sky, then made a rising motion with her hands. Annie frowned, not understanding. The boy said something to Nakoma, his voice low and impatient. Nakoma shook her head and tried again, pointing to Annie, then mimicking walking. "You want me to come with you?" Annie asked, pointing to herself and then across the river. Nakoma nodded vigorously, relief clear on her face. She tugged at Annie's sleeve and pointed again to the sky, making the same rising motion. "Now? Before sunrise?" Annie guessed, mimicking the sun coming up. Another nod from Nakoma. The boy shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with being at a settler's cabin. He wore a knife at his belt and carried a bow slung across his back. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the surrounding area as if expecting danger. Annie hesitated only a moment. In the few months since her parents died, she'd learned to trust her instincts. Something important was happening, and Nakoma had come to include her. She held up one finger, asking them to wait, and quickly pulled on her warmest dress and boots. She grabbed her woolen shawl and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. Outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. Frost crunched beneath their feet as Nakoma led Annie toward the river, the boy following a few paces behind. At the water's edge, Annie saw that flat stones had been placed to create a more stable crossing path than before. Someone had made a bridge of sorts, not for wagons or horses, but perfect for careful footsteps. Nakoma pointed to the stones with a smile, then took Annie's hand and helped her onto the first one. The boy went ahead, moving with the silent grace of someone used to traveling through forest without making a sound. Together they crossed the river, the water gurgling beneath them, still flowing despite the ice forming along its edges. On the other side, Annie found herself in territory she'd never entered before. Though she'd lived within sight of the Shawnee lands all her life, settlers rarely ventured across the river, and the native people kept mostly to themselves. The forest here looked the same as the one near her cabin, yet somehow different, the paths narrower, marked by signs she couldn't read but that Nakoma and the boy followed with confidence. They walked for nearly half an hour, moving deeper into the woods. The boy led, occasionally stopping to listen or look at something Annie couldn't see. Nakoma stayed beside Annie, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Though no words passed between them, Annie felt a growing excitement from her friend. The forest began to thin, and through the trees, Annie could make out a clearing ahead. Nakoma touched her arm, signaling her to stop. The boy had already disappeared among the trees. Nakoma pointed ahead and put a finger to her lips, then beckoned Annie to follow, moving more slowly now. They crept to the edge of the clearing. Annie's eyes widened at what she saw. In the center stood a circle of stones, each taller than a man and covered with carvings. The first rays of the rising sun were just touching the eastern stones, making the symbols carved into them seem to glow with inner light. Around the circle stood a group of Shawnee, mostly elders and a few younger people about Nakoma's age. Among them, Annie recognized Nakoma's grandmother, who wore a headdress of feathers and shells. She was singing in a low, melodic voice, her hands raised to the lightening sky. Nakoma pulled Annie down to crouch behind a fallen log. From this hiding place, they could watch without being seen. Annie started to ask a question, but Nakoma shook her head and pointed to her eyes, then to the circle. "Watch," the gesture said. "Just watch." As the sun rose higher, its light crept across the stone circle. When it reached the center stone, larger than the others and marked with a spiral pattern, the grandmother stopped singing. A hush fell over the gathered people. The grandmother knelt and placed something at the base of the center stone, a small clay pot. From where they hid, Annie could see steam rising from it. The boy who had guided them appeared suddenly at the edge of the clearing opposite them. He carried something in his arms, a fawn, its white spots still visible on its reddish coat. The animal lay still but breathing, its large eyes open and alert. Annie could see blood matted on its hind leg. The grandmother gestured, and the boy brought the fawn to the center of the circle. With gentle hands, he laid it on a bed of soft ferns that had been prepared. The grandmother knelt beside it, dipped her fingers into the steaming pot, and began to apply whatever was inside to the fawn's wounded leg. Nakoma leaned close to Annie's ear and whispered something. Not English words, but Annie caught the reverent tone. This was something sacred they were witnessing, something not meant for outsider eyes. Yet Nakoma had brought her here, had wanted her to see. For several minutes the grandmother worked over the fawn, singing softly. The other elders joined in, their voices blending in harmony that made Annie's skin prickle with its beauty. The sun continued to rise, its light now fully illuminating the stone circle. Then something remarkable happened. The fawn, which had lain so still, suddenly stood up. It tested its injured leg cautiously, then with more confidence. The grandmother stepped back, her face serene as the young deer took one tentative step, then another. A murmur ran through the watching people. The fawn looked around at the circle of humans, showing no fear. Then, as if released from some invisible bond, it leapt forward and bounded out of the circle, disappearing into the forest on the far side. A cheer went up from the gathered Shawnee, hands raised to the morning sky in thanks. Nakoma squeezed Annie's hand, her face glowing with pride and joy. Annie squeezed back, understanding now why her friend had wanted her to see this. The grandmother hadn't just been treating an injured animal. She'd been showing the healing power that flowed through all living things, the connection between the people, the land, the animals, and the sky above. As the ceremony ended and the people began to disperse, Nakoma tugged Annie deeper into the forest before they could be seen. They took a different path back, longer but more beautiful, passing a small waterfall where the morning light created tiny rainbows in the spray. When they reached the river crossing, Nakoma stopped. From around her neck she took a small carved pendant, a tiny fawn made of polished wood. She placed it in Annie's palm and closed her fingers around it, just as her grandmother had done with the bracelet. Annie understood. She had been given more than just a glimpse of a ceremony today. She had been trusted with something precious, a friendship that crossed the boundaries between their worlds. She touched the pendant, then her heart, trying to show what the gift meant to her. As Annie crossed back to her side of the river, she looked back once. Nakoma stood watching her, the morning sun turning her black hair to fire. She raised her hand in farewell, and Annie did the same, knowing somehow that things had changed between them. What had begun as a simple act of kindness at the river was growing into something neither of them could have imagined, something that might, in ways they couldn't yet see, change far more than just their own lives. Autumn gave way to winter with a suddenness that took even the old-timers by surprise. One day the trees were aflame with color, and the next a heavy snow fell, covering everything in a silent white blanket. The river that separated Annie's world from Nakoma's began to freeze in patches, making crossing dangerous. Annie could see Nakoma occasionally on the far bank. They would wave to each other, sometimes leaving small gifts on their respective shores. Annie left a jar of preserved berries one day, and the next morning found a beautifully woven basket in its place. But the weather and the treacherous ice kept them apart. Winter settled in hard around the little cabin. Annie spent her days tending the fire, mending clothes, and trying not to worry about her dwindling supplies. The townsfolk had been good to her, bringing extra firewood and food when they could, but heavy snow had made the trail to town nearly impassable. Just until spring, she told herself on the coldest nights, when the wind howled around the cabin corners and she huddled beneath every blanket she owned. Pa always said everything looks better in spring. She wore Nakoma's bracelet and kept the carved fawn pendant in her pocket, touching it often like a talisman. On clear days, she would walk to the river's edge and look across, wondering what Nakoma was doing and if her people were faring better in the harsh weather. It was during one such walk, nearly 6 weeks into winter, that Annie noticed something unusual. Tracks in the snow, not deer or rabbit, but human footprints leading from the river to the forest behind her cabin. They weren't her own, and no one from town had visited in days. Annie followed the tracks cautiously. They led to a massive old oak tree where she and Pa had often collected acorns. At the base of the tree, tucked into a hollow between two roots, she found a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside was a pouch of tea leaves that smelled of pine and something sweet she couldn't identify, along with a crude drawing of a person drinking from a cup and then sleeping peacefully. "From Nakoma's grandmother," Annie whispered, understanding at once. The healing tea for winter coughs, just like the one they had shared that night. She looked across the frozen river but saw no one. Whoever had delivered the gift was long gone. That night Annie brewed the tea as she'd been shown. Its warmth spread through her chest, easing the tight feeling that had been growing there for days. She slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning brought another surprise. The townsfolk arrived with a sled piled high with supplies: flour, salt pork, dried apples, and more firewood. Mr. Baker, who owned the general store, had his son Tom with him, a boy about 16 who'd always been kind to Annie. "Thought you might be running low," Mr. Baker said, helping Tom carry everything inside. Trail finally cleared enough for the horses. "Thank you," Annie said, overwhelmed by their generosity. "I was starting to worry." Mr. Baker's face grew serious. "Actually, there's another reason we came. There's been trouble." Annie felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "What kind of trouble?" "Hank Wilson's prize bull went missing 3 days ago." Footprints in the snow led toward the river. He hesitated. "Toward Shawnee land." "The Shawnee wouldn't steal a bull," Annie said immediately, thinking of Nakoma and her family. "Folks are saying different," Tom said, his young face troubled. "Pa says there's talk of forming a party to go across the river and demand the bull back. Maybe take some of their horses as payment." "That would start a war," Annie whispered, horrified. Mr. Baker nodded grimly. "That's what I told them at the town meeting last night." Cooler heads prevailed for now, but Hank's got a lot of friends and that bull was worth plenty. After they left, Annie paced the cabin floor, the wooden pendant clutched tight in her hand. She needed to warn Nakoma somehow, but crossing the ice would be foolish, a death sentence if she fell through. As darkness fell, snow began again, fat flakes swirling in the wind. Annie stood at her window watching the world disappear under white. A movement caught her eye. Something dark against the snow moving toward her cabin from the river. Her heart jumped. Had one of the townsmen decided to cross over after all? She grabbed her shawl and Pa's old hunting knife, though she had no idea what she'd do with it. At the door she hesitated, then took a deep breath and pulled it open. A figure stood on her walkway, snow dusting their shoulders and hair. Not one of the townsmen, but Nakoma, her face tight with urgency. Behind her, partially hidden by the falling snow, stood her brother, bow in hand, scanning the darkness with wary eyes. "Nakoma," Annie gasped. "How did you cross?" "The ice." Nakoma cut her off with a gesture, pulling her outside and pointing urgently back toward town. She made motions like an animal with horns, then pointed to her people's side of the river and shook her head vehemently. "The bull?" Annie asked. "You're saying your people didn't take it?" Nakoma nodded, relief crossing her features that Annie understood. She spoke rapidly in her own language, her brother occasionally adding a word. Though Annie couldn't understand, the fear in their faces was clear enough. "The townspeople think your tribe stole Hank Wilson's bull," Annie explained slowly, using gestures to help convey her meaning. "Some want to come across the river to take it back or take your horses instead." Nakoma's eyes widened. She and her brother exchanged words, his face darkening with anger. He spoke sharply, pointing toward town, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Nakoma grabbed his arm, speaking quickly. He subsided, but the tension in his body remained. She turned back to Annie and pointed to herself, then made walking motions toward town, then held her hands up in what Annie understood as a plea for peace. "No," Annie said firmly. "You can't go to town. Some of the men there, they wouldn't listen. They might hurt you." Nakoma seemed to understand. She frowned, thinking, then suddenly her face lit up. She drew in the snow with her finger, a crude picture of a bull, then another animal beside it. She pointed to the second animal, then to the forest north of town. "Another animal took the bull?" Annie guessed. "A bear wolf?" Nakoma shook her head. She pointed to herself, her brother, then made two-legged walking motions. "People?" Annie asked. "But not your people?" Nakoma nodded vigorously. She drew again, this time a river different from the one between their homes and figures on horses beside it. "The river to the north?" Annie asked, understanding dawning. "The Fox tribe?" Another nod, even more emphatic. The Fox were another native tribe, one that had occasionally traded with the settlement but more often kept their distance. Annie had heard Pa speak of tensions between them and the Shawnee. Nakoma's brother spoke again, gesturing toward the northern forest. Annie caught the name Wilson among his words and understood. The Fox tribe had taken Wilson's bull, perhaps to cast blame on the Shawnee. "We have to tell the townspeople," Annie said, "before someone does something terrible." She mimicked crossing the river, pointing to town and showing Nakoma and her brother with her. They both shook their heads. Nakoma pointed to Annie, then to town, and made a speaking gesture. "You want me to go alone? To tell them?" Nakoma nodded, then tapped the carved pendant visible in Annie's hand and placed her other hand over her heart. "Trust," the gesture said. "I trust you to speak for us." The weight of that trust settled on Annie's shoulders. She nodded slowly. "I'll go tomorrow, first thing." "I'll make them listen." Relief softened Nakoma's features. She embraced Annie quickly, her arms strong and warm despite the cold. As she turned to leave, she pressed something into Annie's hand, a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew. "For courage," she said in halting English, the first words Annie had heard her speak in her language. "Grandmother say." Tears pricked Annie's eyes at this effort to bridge the gap between them. "Thank you," she whispered. "Be careful crossing back." She stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared into the swirling snow. The herbs in her hand gave off a sharp, clean scent that somehow made her stand straighter, her resolve firming. Tomorrow she would go to town and stand before men who still saw her as just a child. She would speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She would prevent a war. Inside, she placed the herbs by her bed and lay down, though sleep seemed impossible with her mind racing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints that led from her door to the river, erasing all evidence of Nakoma's desperate visit. By morning, it would be as if they had never come at all. Only Annie would know the truth, and somehow, she would have to make the others believe it. As she drifted finally toward sleep, one thought kept circling in her mind. How strange that helping one limping girl across a river could lead to this, to standing between two worlds, trying to build a bridge where others would put up walls. Pa would be proud, she thought, Ma too, and with that comforting idea she finally slept, the carved fawn pendant clutched tightly in her hand like a promise.